Lord, the light of your love is shining in the midst of the darkness shining. Jesus, light of the world, shine upon us. Set us free by the truth you now bring us. Shine on me. Shine on me. Shine, Jesus, shine. Fill this land with the Father's glory. Blaze, Spirit, blaze. Set our hearts on fire. Flow, river, flow. Flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be light.
Good morning and welcome to another episode of Let the Bible Speak. My name is Alex Meredith and I'm the minister for the Marquette Church of Christ here in the UP. I want to start by telling you a story, if you haven't heard it, the story of a man named Horatio Spafford. Horatio Gates Spafford, he was born on October 20th in the year 1828 in the state of New York. Later in his life, he married an Anna Larson, who was actually a Norwegian immigrant on September 5th of 1861. They had 4 daughters together, Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta. He was a lawyer and a real estate investor, living later on in the city of Chicago. In 1871, you had the Great Fire of Chicago, which burned down much of the city, including many of Spafford's real estate investments, really causing some financial turmoil there. In 1873, 2 years later, the family had decided to take a family trip over to England. But there were some last-minute issues regarding the zoning of some of Spafford's properties and real estate investments. All of that confusion caused by the fire a couple of years ago. And so he actually last minute had to stay behind, and he decided to send his family on the way and he'd go and meet them when he could. November 22nd, 1873, the Ville du Havre, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, it's a Dutch ship, but the Ville du Havre, the ship that he should have been on, collided with another vessel and eventually sank, killing tragically 226 people. Horatio's wife Anna arrived in Wales and sent him a 2-word telegram which said, "Saved, alone." Sometimes the houses we stand in, which we once believed to be unbreakable, begin to crumble, and we soon find ourselves standing in its ruins. Speaking of people standing in the ruins of life, today we're going to talk about a man named Job. The man of Job, really a remarkable story in the Bible if you aren't familiar. But Job was a man living in Mesopotamia during, it's assumed, probably during the patriarchal period, probably living in what became known as the region of Babylon. He's living in the land of Uz, it says in the introduction. So I want to read to you a little bit about him from Job chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. So listen to this, this description of quite a remarkable man. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants, so that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. So this was a man who had everything. He had everything you could imagine materially, religiously. It said that this was a man who was blameless before God. He had everything until he didn't. What follows, we're not going to read it, but in Job 1, 6 through 12, we see that God actually It's a strange scene. God makes a deal with Satan that in a test of Job's faith, God would allow, and that's a very important word. God is not the instigator of this, but it says that God allows Satan to, quote, touch all that he has, right? So here's what happens. Job 1, starting in verse 13, a test of Job's faith. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them, and took them, and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword. And I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 groups and made a raid on the camels and took them and struck down the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. That's really remarkable, what happens there in that short span of time. We see at first there's a report about the Sabaeans stealing his oxen and donkeys, and some of his servants are killed, which, that's bad. That's a tragedy for sure. But then, while he's still talking, another messenger comes and says, the fire of God came down, which, by the way, is a really interesting way to put it when we know that God is allowing Satan to do these things. Anyway, just something to think about. But it says the fire of God came down and fell from the sky, burning up his sheep and some of his servants. And then it says that the Chaldeans, they came and stole some of his camels, killed some of his servants. And then finally, a windstorm came and blew the house over of his eldest son and killed all 10 of his children. I mean, this is a man who in a short span of time lost just about everything he had. I say just about everything because there are 2 things as of yet he hasn't lost. 1, his faith, and 2, his health. At least not yet. But then here's what happens. In the section after this, God allows Satan to, quote, touch his bone and his flesh to take away his health. Job 2, starting in verse 7. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a piece of broken pottery with which to scrape himself while he sat in the ashes. He lost his wealth, he lost his family, he lost his health. Just one of those, by the way, in and of itself would be enough tragedy for a lifetime. And he loses all of it at once. Can you even imagine? Now, I empathize with Job here, not because I've been in his exact situation or I know exactly what that's like, but because I know to some degree what it feels like to have the whole world feel like it's falling apart right around you, and you end up sitting helplessly in the ashes wondering what to do next, if anything at all. I know that feeling. Sometimes personal ruin can come to us as a result of our own mistakes. It's our own doing. We mess up sometimes, right? And by the way, lest you think you're immune to it, we are all just one mistake, one terrible mistake away from absolute disaster. And sometimes ruin comes to us through circumstances that are totally beyond our control. And that's what happens here with Job, right? Now, the causes of the ruin may vary, and so will the intensity of the person's suffering. But one thing's for sure, ruin will come, right? I mean, suffering doesn't discriminate. God, we're told, sends rain on the just and on the unjust. The book of Job is really an investigation into suffering. It's a really common theme in ancient literature, actually. In fact, there are many similar stories that are very reminiscent of what we see with Job. There are many stories that are similar to that, written around the same time in the region of Babylon. And typically, here's how the story goes. You'll have some man who suffers. He has catastrophe hit him. And then he goes on this quest to discover the root of the suffering, and in that quest he discovers that a divine force enacted the suffering, and that the cause ultimately was because of his own sin and his own wrongdoing. Right? This whole book, this, by the way, that whole thing, that's exactly what Job's friends suggest. Job's friends, they come by him after all this catastrophe hits. You have some of his friends coming alongside him. The very best thing that they did, by the way, was they actually go, and it says at the end of chapter 2, they just go sit with him, and they don't say a thing. I think it says they sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights. That's chapter 2, verse 13. And they didn't say a word. That was the best thing that they did. Because right after the fact, they go and try to fix it. They say, Job, I think this is what's going on. And I think this is how you fix it. And all of them suggest exactly what all those other stories say, right? Which is, no matter how righteous you claim to be, surely you messed up somewhere. God is just. He wouldn't just do this for no reason, right? There's some reason behind this, and it's probably that you're messed up. And so they put that proposition out there. But Job is a rebuttal to all of these stories, right? That proposition is put out there, but ultimately it's rejected because Job is not actually focused on the cause of the suffering. After Job's friends spend hours and days trying to explain the root of his suffering, they're actually rebuked for it. Look at Job 38. Job 38, starting in verse 2. We'll read through verse 7. Here we go. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? By the way, I've just got to say, there's a song out there called 10,000 Words by the Avett Brothers. And I think the very beginning of the song is about how we like to say all these words, there are all these words out there, and we like to talk about all these things that we know nothing about. There's Job for you. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you will make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? And of course the answer is, you have no idea. You don't know. Your friends don't know. They were rebuked for it. God, funny enough, God never tells Job about this whole deal that he had made with Satan. He never tells him anything about that. He never gives Job an answer as to this is why this is all happening to you. All he does really is he points out the foolishness and the arrogance of those who think that they have an answer. That's what he does. Because Job, it's not about the cause. God isn't concerned with us understanding why we're suffering so much as he is concerned with how we respond to our suffering. You see the difference? The Bible talks a lot about suffering, and really, frankly, rarely does it give an answer. But it tells us a lot about suffering people, some of whom dealt quite poorly with the whole situation, and some of whom dealt remarkably with it, remarkably faithfully with it. I want to go to the book of Habakkuk, actually. The book of Habakkuk is fascinating. In this prophetic book, you have Habakkuk who's being told about the impending doom of Judah, how Babylon is going to come from the north and they're going to destroy the people of Judah. And Habakkuk is asking God questions. Why is this happening? Why are you allowing these wicked people to come and take us over? We're your people and they're not. And they have sort of a back and forth a few times. And long story short, at the end, Habakkuk doesn't really get an answer that he's satisfied with. He's still a little confused and he's still worried and upset by the whole situation. But this is what he says at the end of it. This is from Habakkuk 3, starting in verse 16. I hear, and my body trembles. My lips quiver at the sound. Rottenness enters into my bones. My legs tremble beneath me. Yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon people who invade us. Though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. That's a remarkable testimony of faith. Then we go to Lamentations. Lamentations is written while Jeremiah the prophet is sitting there watching his own brothers and sisters be slaughtered in Jerusalem. Overlooking the city, seeing this disaster come upon his hometown. And this is what he writes. This is from Lamentations 3, starting in verse 13. He drove into my kidneys the arrow of his quiver. I have become the laughingstock of all peoples, the object of their taunts all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has sated me with wormwood. He has made my teeth grind on gravel and made me cower in ashes. My soul is bereft of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. So I say, my endurance has perished. So has my hope from the Lord. Maybe that's where some of us feel like we are, sitting in the ashes. We've forgotten what happiness is. Our endurance has perished. So is my hope from the Lord. But then he continues in verse 19, remember my affliction and my wanderings, the wormwood and the gall. My soul continually remembers it and is bowed down within me. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore, I will hope in him. There's a song about this passage. I don't know if you know it. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. It's a rather happy and you almost might say a triumphant sounding song. But you think about the tone in which this is actually written. It's not, yay, this is fantastic, all is wonderful. It's the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. I mean, I can't see it now, and I don't know if I'll see it for a long time, but I know he is faithful. It must have been so hard to say that. I mean, that's really an incredible and remarkable statement of faith. And here's how Job responded to his suffering. We go back to Job, and actually we're going to go back to Job chapter 1, starting in verse 20, and then we're going to read a section in chapter 2. So Job 1, verse 20, let's start there. Then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And then you go down to chapter 2, verse 9. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God? And shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, Job is grieved, and there's no surprise there. I mean, how could you not grieve in a situation like that? But here's what is surprising. He chose to trust God, and not just trust God, he chose to worship God through his suffering, even when his confusion and anger probably made it really tempting not to. You know, there's a temptation when we get ourselves into situations like this, when the world is falling apart around us. There's a temptation to distance ourselves from faith, from the church, from God. But that's when we need it the most, right? And if you think about it, Job's faith is just about all he had left. His own wife had turned against him, essentially. And so Job chose faith, but not because he had reasoned it all out. And that's the funny thing here. It's not as if he suddenly got an answer and he says, okay, well, now that I've got my answer, I can go on my merry way. He never got an answer. But he trusted God, whose goodness is, by the way, not dependent on the amount of suffering we experience in our lives. God is good all of the time, sometimes despite what we feel based on our own experiences. Not only did Job choose faith, he also chose life. Job chapter 3, verse 11, starting in verse 11, we see that there were times when Job, he didn't want to keep going. Why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept, then I would have been at rest. Verse 16, why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked ceased from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. He could have ended it all, but he chose to keep going, and he chose to submit to God's purpose for his life. A number of years ago now, I came across there's a young woman who had a tattoo on her arm, and all that the tattoo was a semicolon. That's all it was. One dot on top and a comma on bottom, right? A semicolon. And I was intrigued by that. I had not seen that before, and I asked her, well, what's that about? What does that mean? And she said, she was very open with me, and she shared that there was a time in her life when she felt that she didn't want to keep going, but she chose to anyway. And that's what a semicolon is. I could have stopped, but I chose to go on. Grammatically, that's what it functions as. It separates two independent clauses. You could either put a period and then start a new sentence, or you can put a semicolon and keep going with that sentence. And anyway, not to bore you with the details of grammar, but that's the idea behind it. I could have stopped, but I chose to keep going. And there's something inspiring about that. I'm not a big tattoo guy myself, but I was really touched by that. That was powerful and memorable. And do you know what the result of Job's choice to keep going was, by the way? Look at Job 42, at the very end of the book. Job 42, starting in verse 12. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. And he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 female donkeys. He had also 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first daughter Jemimah, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Keren-Happuch. And in all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughters. And their father gave them an inheritance among their brothers. And after this Job lived 140 years, and saw his sons and his sons' sons 4 generations. And Job died an old man and full of days. You never know what God has planned for you. So be careful about abandoning your faith, about abandoning your life when ruin comes. For one thing, and I guess I'll touch on 2 reasons here. For one thing, your anger towards God may not even be justified. We often make bad and incorrect assumptions about what God did or didn't do, what he could have done, what he should have done. Choose to trust in the God you know him to be from Scripture, not the God you think he might be based on your own emotion or your own personal experience, right? Our emotions are often irrational, and that's okay. There's a purpose to them. I think about Isaiah 55:9, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Secondly, the second reason, God has a plan for you. He has a plan for you right now, and He has a plan for you eternally. Ephesians 1 says that you were adopted as children before the foundation of the earth was established. He had chosen that you and me and everyone else were going to be His children, and we're going to be with Him. God has an eternal purpose for you. Horatio Spafford, after learning of the incident that killed his 4 daughters, he decided to set off to Wales and meet his wife, Anna. And the ship actually passed by nearby the site where his 4 daughters had drowned and lost their life. And somehow he had the courage to write these words: "When peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." When ruin comes, I hope that I have the courage to have faith. And it is a courageous choice. Because it's easier to say, you know what, I'm done with this, I can't bear with this any longer, I'm going to distance myself. But it takes courage to have faith. Courage to trust that God's promises, like those in Revelation, will be fulfilled, that Jesus will return, that the dead will be raised, that the wicked will be judged, and that all who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb will enter into an eternal home. A home with no mourning, nor crying, nor pain. So, my plea to you today is that you keep going, that you endure, knowing that there's something better over the horizon, that you take hold of these promises, that you have faith. And that's something that, as I mentioned last week, if that's something you're interested in learning more about, we want to help you do that. We'll wrap up by telling you about some of the resources we have to help you do that. We have a 7-part workbook program. It's called the Master's Series by World Bible School. We could send these out to you as sort of an aid to help get you oriented to the Bible. If you don't have a Bible to help you do that, or you don't have one anyway, just let us know. We have hardcover ESV copies we send out totally free of charge. The contact info is up on the screen. You can see our mailing info there at the top. You can reach us at the P.O. Box 372 in Marquette, zip code 49855. You can also find a lot of this information and contact us through letthebiblespeak.net. And finally, our podcast for the program is available at Let the Bible Speak UP, and that's available on both Podbean and Spotify. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. May God bless you. Have a wonderful week.
Glory blaze, Spirit blaze, set our hearts on fire. Flow, river flow, flood the nations with grace and mercy. Send forth your word, Lord, and let there be